Welcome, traveler, to a city whose very name became synonymous with human ambition itself. You stand now where the impossible once rose from river mud, where humanity first dared to organize chaos into law, where priests calculated the movements of planets with such precision that their mathematics still governs our clocks and compasses today. But here is the question that haunts every stone beneath your feet. How did a small settlement of reed huts, clustered along canals in a flood-prone delta, transform into the greatest metropolis the ancient world had ever witnessed? What drove these people to build towers reaching toward heaven, to carve laws into black stone that would echo through every legal system for 4,000 years, to create gardens that defied gravity and reason? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did this beacon of civilization, this gate of the gods, crumble into sand and silence, forgotten for millennia, until shovels struck its buried magnificence? The warm light falls across these reconstructed walls of glazed brick, each tile fired in techniques lost and rediscovered. The deep blues of lapis lazuli shimmer on the Ishtar gate before you, and the golden lions of the processional way seem almost to breathe in this amber glow. This is Babylon, as Nebuchadnezzar knew it, as the exiled peoples of Jerusalem wept beside its rivers, as Cyrus the Great entered through its legendary defenses without a single arrow fired. What you are about to experience is not a fragment or a glimpse. This is the complete story of Babylon, from its humble emergence around 2100 years before Christ, through the revolutionary reign of Hammurabi, across 4 centuries of Kassite rule, into the blazing glory of the Neo-Babylonian revival, and finally through its conquest, decline, and rediscovery. You will walk these streets when they were young and when they were ancient. You will witness the scribes pressing cuneiform into wet clay, the astronomers mapping constellations from ziggurat summits, the merchants trading along canals that connected the known world. Every 60 minutes you count, every circle you divide, every legal protection you enjoy descends from innovations born here, between the Tigris and Euphrates, in this cradle of civilization. If you find yourself drawn to these complete journeys through ancient worlds, please subscribe so you never miss our next exploration. Each week, we bring you the full story of a lost civilization, from first foundations to final echoes. Now, let us begin our journey in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where reeds bend beneath winds that carry the seeds of everything we call civilization. Long before Babylon rose from the alluvial plains, before its name echoed through the corridors of power, the land between 2 rivers stirred with humanity's earliest experiments in civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates carved their paths through what is now southern Iraq, depositing rich silt across a flat, treeless expanse where summer temperatures scorched the earth, and winter rains transformed dust into mud. Here, around 6,000 years before the Common Era, scattered communities of reed hut dwellers began transforming marshland into something unprecedented. The earliest settlements clustered near water channels, their inhabitants learning to redirect seasonal floods into irrigation ditches. Eridu emerged first, its temple platform rising from the wetlands around 5,400 years before the Common Era. The Sumerians who built it spoke a language unlike any other known tongue, its origins still debated by scholars. They called their land Kengir, the civilized place, and they believed the gods had chosen this delta for humanity's awakening. Uruk followed, swelling into the world's first true city by 3,500 years before the Common Era. Within its mud brick walls, 40,000 people lived in organized quarters. Potters shaped vessels on spinning wheels. Metal workers hammered copper into tools. Weavers produced textiles for trade across vast distances. The White Temple crowned Uruk's central precinct, its whitewashed walls gleaming against brown earth, dedicated to Anu, Lord of the Heavens. The need to track grain stores, labor obligations, and temple offerings drove the invention that would define Mesopotamian civilization. Around 3,300 years before the Common Era, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets using cut reeds. Cuneiform writing began as simple pictographs representing barley, sheep, and jars of oil. Over centuries, these symbols evolved into a complex system capable of recording poetry, law, and astronomical observations. City-states multiplied across the southern plains. Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and dozens more competed for water rights, trade routes, and divine favor. Each city centered on a temple complex where priests mediated between mortals and gods. Ziggurats rose as artificial mountains, their stepped platforms ascending toward the heavens. The Lugal, meaning great man, emerged as a new kind of leader, combining military command with religious authority. Warfare became endemic. Copper-tipped spears clashed in disputes over irrigation canals. The stelae of vultures, carved around 2,400 years before the Common Era, depicts soldiers of Lagash marching in tight phalanx formation, their overlapping shields creating walls of leather and bronze. Prisoners kneel in nets, awaiting sacrifice or slavery. Victory hymns praised kings who expanded their city's boundaries. Trade networks stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean coast. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, copper from Oman, and carnelian from Gujarat flowed into Sumerian workshops. Cylinder seals carved from precious stones rolled across clay, leaving intricate impressions that authenticated documents and marked ownership. These tiny objects reveal a world of mythological imagery, ritual scenes, and administrative precision. The gods of Sumer established patterns that would persist for millennia. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, ruled from Nippur. Enki, keeper of wisdom and fresh water, dwelt in Eridu's watery shrine. Inanna, goddess of love and war, demanded devotion in Uruk. Their temples accumulated wealth through offerings, land grants, and the labor of dependent workers. Religion and economy intertwined inseparably. By 2,400 years before the Common Era, Sumerian civilization had created writing, urban planning, monumental architecture, codified law, mathematical systems, and astronomical observation. The 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle originated in Sumerian base 60 mathematics. Yet, political unity remained elusive. The city-states exhausted themselves in endless conflict, creating conditions for conquest by outsiders who would forge the first true empire and cast a shadow over a small, unremarkable settlement called Babylon. The exhausted city-states, weakened by generations of fratricidal warfare, could not resist when a man of obscure origins emerged from the shadows of history to forge something unprecedented. Sargon of Akkad, whose very name meant legitimate king, yet whose birth remained shrouded in legend, rose from cupbearer to conqueror around 2334 years before the Common Era. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic tongue distinct from Sumerian, yet they had absorbed Mesopotamian culture through centuries of coexistence. Sargon united these peoples under a single throne, marching his armies from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean cedar forests. his capital at Akkad, a city whose precise location remains lost to archaeology, became the center of the world's first empire spanning multiple peoples, languages, and traditions. Akkadian soldiers carried bronze weapons forged with superior metallurgy. Their composite bows outranged Sumerian infantry. Sargon's military innovations transformed warfare, but his administrative genius proved equally revolutionary. He appointed Akkadian governors over conquered cities, replacing local dynasties with loyal servants of the crown. Trade routes fell under imperial protection. Standardized weights and measures facilitated commerce across vast distances. The empire's reach staggered the ancient imagination. Sargon boasted of washing his weapons in the lower sea and the upper sea. His daughter Enkiduanna became high priestess of the moon god at Ur, composing hymns that represent humanity's first literature attributed to a named author. Akkadian became the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, a status it would maintain for over a millennium. Along the Euphrates, where the river curved through date palm groves, a modest settlement called Bab Elim existed as an unremarkable way station. Its name, meaning Gate of God, suggested nothing of future greatness. Akkadian administrators recorded it among countless provincial towns, paying tribute to the imperial treasury. Mud brick houses clustered around a small shrine. Fishermen cast nets into the river. Farmers tended barley fields irrigated by simple canals. Sargon's grandson, Naram Sin, elevated Akkadian power to its zenith around 2250 years before the Common Era. He declared himself a living god, the first Mesopotamian ruler to claim divinity during his lifetime. His victory stele depicted him ascending a mountain, horned crown upon his head, enemies crushed beneath his feet. The empire seemed eternal, blessed by the gods themselves. Yet environmental catastrophe and internal rebellion conspired against Akkadian dominance. Drought gripped the region around 2200 years before the Common Era. Harvests failed across the Fertile Crescent. Nomadic peoples called the Gudians descended from the Zagros Mountains, raiding weakened cities. Provincial governors declared independence. The empire fragmented with terrifying speed. By 2154 years before the Common Era, Akkadian power had collapsed entirely. The Gudians ruled through terror for nearly a century before Sumerian cities reasserted themselves under the third dynasty of Ur. This final Sumerian renaissance produced magnificent ziggurats and elaborate bureaucracies, yet it too would crumble under pressure from Amorite nomads migrating from the western deserts. Throughout these upheavals, the small settlement of Babylon endured. Its strategic position along the Euphrates, where northern and southern trade routes intersected, ensured modest prosperity regardless of which empire claimed sovereignty. Akkadian cultural influence persisted in its scribal traditions, its religious practices, its very language. The shadow of Sargon's achievement stretched across centuries, demonstrating that unified empire remained possible for those bold enough to seize it. The Akkadian collapse left a fractured landscape of competing powers. Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and other cities vied for regional dominance. Into this chaos, Amorite chieftains established themselves as rulers of ancient Sumerian cities. One Amorite dynasty would claim Babylon around 1894 years before the Common Era, transforming an obscure provincial town into the seed of future empire. The Gate of God awaited its moment. The western desert stirred with movement. Across the Syrian steppe, through wadis carved by seasonal rains, families traveled with their flocks toward the fertile valleys. These were the Amuru, the Westerners, whom Sumerian scribes had long regarded with suspicion and contempt. Cuneiform tablets describe them as people who knew no grain, who ate raw meat, who possessed no houses, who remained unburied at death. Yet these wanderers would reshape Mesopotamian civilization. The migrations intensified as the third millennium, before the Common Era, drew toward its close. Climate shifts dried the marginal pasture lands. The collapse of Akkadian authority removed the military barriers that had once contained nomadic movement. Amorite bands filtered into the settled regions, sometimes as mercenaries serving city-state armies, sometimes as laborers seeking seasonal work, sometimes as raiders exploiting political chaos. Their presence transformed the demographic landscape of the entire Tigris-Euphrates basin. The Amorites brought their own traditions. Their tribal structures emphasized kinship bonds and patriarchal authority. Their gods included storm deities and pastoral protectors unfamiliar to urban Mesopotamians. Their language, a Northwest Semitic tongue distinct from Akkadian, introduced new vocabulary and expressions into the scribal tradition. Yet, the Amorites proved remarkably adaptable, absorbing Mesopotamian culture even as they altered it. By the 20th century before the Common Era, Amorite chieftains had established themselves as rulers throughout Mesopotamia. They adopted cuneiform writing, worshipped Sumerian and Akkadian deities alongside their ancestral gods, and governed through traditional bureaucratic structures. The transformation occurred gradually, through marriage alliances, military service, and commercial integration rather than sudden conquest. Babylon remained a modest settlement during these transitional decades. Its temples served local agricultural communities. Its merchants participated in regional trade networks. Its scribes maintained administrative records in the Akkadian tradition. Nothing distinguished it from dozens of similar towns scattered across the alluvial plain. The city awaited the dynasty that would elevate it from obscurity. Around 1894 years before the Common Era, an Amorite leader named Sumu-Abum established independent rule over Babylon. The circumstances of his rise remain obscure in surviving records. Perhaps he served as a military commander who seized power during political upheaval. Perhaps his family had governed as vassals before claiming sovereignty. Whatever his origins, Sumu-Abum founded what later generations would call the First Dynasty of Babylon. The early Babylonian kings faced formidable challenges. Powerful rivals surrounded them. Isin claimed legitimate succession from the Third Dynasty of Ur. Larsa controlled vital irrigation networks and trade routes. Eshnunna dominated the Diyala region. Assyria grew strong in the northern reaches. Babylon possessed neither the territory nor the resources to challenge these established powers directly. Survival demanded careful diplomacy. The First Dynasty kings cultivated alliances, avoided unnecessary conflicts, and focused on consolidating control over their immediate hinterland. They invested in Babylon's infrastructure, expanding temples, improving fortifications, and developing agricultural lands. Each generation strengthened the foundations upon which future greatness would rest. The city's physical transformation accelerated. Mud brick walls rose higher and thicker. New residential quarters accommodated growing populations. Temple precincts expanded to honor both traditional Mesopotamian deities and the Amorite gods whom the ruling dynasty favored. The cult of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, gained prominence, though the god remained a minor figure in the broader Mesopotamian pantheon. Trade networks connected Babylon to distant regions. Merchants brought tin from the Iranian plateau, timber from Lebanon, precious stones from Afghanistan. Babylonian textiles and agricultural products flowed outward along caravan routes. Commercial prosperity supported urban growth and funded royal ambitions. 5 generations of kings maintained and expanded Sumu Abum's legacy. Sin-Muballit, the 5th ruler, strengthened Babylon's position through strategic warfare and diplomatic marriage. His campaigns extended Babylonian territory and weakened rival states. Yet, even Sin-Muballit could not have anticipated what his son would achieve. The prince who would become Hammurabi observed his father's statecraft, learning the arts of war and governance that would transform a regional power into an empire. The Amorite wanderers had planted deep roots in Mesopotamian soil. The throne passed to young hands in 1792, before the Common Era. Sin-Muballit, weakened by age and illness, watched his son assume the burdens of kingship over a city still vulnerable, still surrounded by powers that could crush it. Hammurabi inherited not an empire, but a precarious position, a modest territory hemmed by rivals who commanded greater armies and controlled richer lands. The young king surveyed a world of predators. To the south, Larsa dominated the ancient Sumerian heartland under Rim-Sin, a ruler who had already reigned for 3 decades and absorbed city after city into his realm. To the north, Shamshi-Adad controlled an Assyrian kingdom stretching from the Tigris to the Euphrates headwaters. To the east, Elam lurked beyond the Zagros Mountains, its armies capable of sweeping across the plains. Eshnunna commanded the Diyala River Valley, controlling crucial trade routes. Any of these powers could have extinguished Babylon's flickering ambition. Hammurabi chose patience over aggression. The first years of his reign focused on internal consolidation rather than conquest. Canal systems received attention. Their channels deepened and extended to bring life-giving water to fields that fed his people. Temple complexes rose or underwent restoration, their construction demonstrating piety while employing laborers and craftsmen. City walls grew stronger, their mud brick ramparts thickened against potential siege. Diplomatic correspondence flowed from Babylon's scribal workshops. Clay tablets carried messages to rival courts, their cuneiform signs conveying respect, proposing alliances, suggesting mutual benefit. Hammurabi positioned himself as a reasonable neighbor, a king interested in stability rather than upheaval. Behind this facade of moderation, intelligence networks gathered information about rival strengths and weaknesses. The balance of power shifted when Shamshi-Adad died around 1776 before the Common Era. His Assyrian kingdom fragmented as sons quarreled over inheritance. Northern Mesopotamia descended into chaos, removing one threat from Hammurabi's calculations. The young Babylonian king observed and waited, allowing rivals to exhaust themselves in conflicts that did not serve his interests. Alliances formed and dissolved across the Mesopotamian political landscape. Hammurabi bound himself to Rim-Sin of Larsa through diplomatic agreements, creating temporary stability along his southern frontier. Similar arrangements with other powers created a web of mutual obligations that protected Babylon while the king built strength. Each treaty bought time, each embassy gathered intelligence, each exchange of gifts masked strategic assessment. Military campaigns began cautiously. Hammurabi moved against smaller targets, cities whose conquest would not provoke coalition responses. Isin fell to Babylonian forces, its capture extending control over productive agricultural territory. Uruk submitted, adding another ancient center to the growing realm. Each victory strengthened Babylon's position while testing the responses of major rivals. The palace at Babylon hummed with administrative activity. Scribes recorded grain shipments, troop movements, diplomatic communications. Archives accumulated tablets documenting every aspect of governance, creating institutional memory that would outlast individual officials. Hammurabi demanded detailed reports from provincial governors, maintaining awareness of conditions throughout his territory. Religious observance reinforced political authority. The king participated in festivals honoring Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, demonstrating the divine sanction underlying his rule. Temple economies integrated with state administration, their vast agricultural holdings and craft workshops contributing to royal revenues. Priests served as advisors, their astronomical observations and omen interpretations guiding royal decisions. By 1764, before the Common Era, Hammurabi had transformed Babylon from a vulnerable city-state into a regional power. His territory had expanded through careful conquest. His treasury had grown through efficient administration. His army had gained experience through limited campaigns. The patient king had positioned himself for greater ambitions, waiting for the moment when rivals would weaken sufficiently to permit decisive action. The cunning that would reshape Mesopotamia had only begun to reveal itself. The moment arrived in 1764 before the Common Era. Rim-Sin of Larsa, the aged king who had dominated southern Mesopotamia for 6 decades, finally overextended his forces. Hammurabi struck with calculated precision, his army sweeping southward along canal networks that generations of engineers had carved through the alluvial plain. The campaign unfolded with methodical efficiency. City after city fell to Babylonian forces, their mud-brick walls offering little resistance against siege techniques perfected through years of preparation. Esin capitulated first, its granaries emptied into Babylonian supply trains. Uruk followed, its ancient temples acknowledging new sovereignty. The sacred city of Ur, once capital of empires, opened its gates rather than face destruction. Larsa itself fell after a siege that lasted mere weeks. Rim-Sin, who had ruled longer than any contemporary monarch, became a prisoner in his own palace. The southern heartland of Sumerian civilization passed under Babylonian control, its agricultural wealth now flowing northward to enrich Hammurabi's treasury. The conquests accelerated. Eshnunna in the east collapsed under combined pressure from Babylon and its allies. Mari, the great trading city on the Middle Euphrates, fell to Babylonian armies in 1761 before the Common Era. Its magnificent palace, with painted walls depicting investiture ceremonies and mythological scenes, became spoils of war. Clay tablets recording decades of diplomatic correspondence were cataloged and archived, their intelligence value recognized by Babylonian administrators. Assyria in the north acknowledged Babylonian supremacy. The Elamite highlands to the east retreated behind their mountain barriers. By 1755, before the Common Era, Hammurabi controlled territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Anatolia, from the Zagros foothills to the Syrian desert. Yet military conquest alone could not sustain such vast dominions. The king understood that lasting empire required more than garrison troops and tribute collectors. It demanded unified systems of justice that transcended local customs and tribal traditions. Scribes labored in palace workshops, their reed styluses pressing cuneiform signs into wet clay. They compiled legal precedents from across Mesopotamia, gathering judgments rendered in temple courts and royal tribunals over centuries. They recorded customary practices governing marriage, inheritance, commerce, and criminal punishment. From this accumulated wisdom, a comprehensive legal framework emerged. The code addressed every aspect of Babylonian society. Physicians faced penalties for failed surgeries, their hands forfeit if patients died under their care. Builders whose structures collapsed bore responsibility for deaths caused by their negligence. Merchants who cheated customers faced severe fines. Wives could divorce husbands who neglected them. Slaves retained certain protections against arbitrary cruelty. A black diorite stele, over 2 meters tall, received the carved text of these laws. At its summit, sculptors depicted Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god of justice, whose rays illuminated truth and dispelled deception. The image proclaimed divine sanction for royal legislation, binding heaven and earth in common purpose. Copies traveled to major cities throughout the empire. Local judges consulted these texts when rendering verdicts, ensuring consistent application of royal justice from the marshlands of the south to the caravan routes of the north. Disputes that once required lengthy appeals to distant authorities could now be resolved through reference to written standards. The administrative machinery expanded to match territorial gains. Provincial governors received detailed instructions regarding tax collection, canal maintenance, and military recruitment. Standardized weights and measures facilitated commerce across regional boundaries. A common calendar synchronized agricultural activities and religious festivals throughout Babylonian domains. Temple complexes integrated into state bureaucracy, their scribal schools training the administrators who would govern conquered territories. Young men learned not only cuneiform writing, but also mathematics, astronomy, and legal procedure. They emerged as instruments of imperial unity, carrying Babylonian methods to every corner of the realm. Hammurabi died in 1750 before the Common Era, having reigned 42 years. His empire stretched across the entire Mesopotamian world, unified under laws that would influence legal thinking for millennia. The stele bearing his code would survive conquest, destruction, and burial, eventually finding its way to modern museums, where visitors still contemplate justice carved in stone over 3,700 years ago. The empire that Hammurabi built began unraveling almost immediately upon his death. Samsu-Iluna inherited a realm stretched thin across Mesopotamia, its administrative apparatus straining under the weight of governing diverse populations who remembered independence. Within the first decade of his reign, the southern cities erupted in coordinated rebellion, their ancient pride refusing permanent subjugation to northern authority. The marshlands of the far south proved impossible to pacify. Rebels established the Sealand dynasty in the wetlands, where the Tigris and Euphrates merged into brackish lagoons, creating a breakaway kingdom that would persist for centuries. Samsu-Iluna's armies could not penetrate the reed-choked waterways where boats vanished into endless channels and solid ground dissolved into treacherous mud. The empire contracted, its southern boundary retreating northward as the marshes swallowed Babylonian authority. Successive kings watched helplessly as peripheral territories slipped away. Abi-Eshu attempted to dam the Tigris itself, hoping to flood the Sealand rebels into submission. But the river proved mightier than royal ambition. The massive engineering project failed, and with it died any hope of reunification. Each generation inherited a smaller realm than the one before, the empire shrinking like water, evaporating under the Mesopotamian sun. Yet, within the diminished borders, Babylonian culture flourished with remarkable intensity. Scribal schools continued copying Hammurabi's laws, preserving legal traditions even as political power waned. Temple workshops produced cylinder seals of extraordinary craftsmanship, their carved surfaces depicting gods and mythological scenes with technical precision that later periods would struggle to match. The intellectual achievements of the empire outlasted its territorial extent. Trade networks adapted to new political realities. Merchants from Babylon maintained commercial relationships with distant partners, exchanging textiles, grain, and manufactured goods along routes that ignored shifting borders. The city's reputation as a center of learning and commerce sustained its prosperity even as military dominance faded. Caravans still arrived at its gates, their donkeys laden with copper from Anatolia and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The final century of the First Dynasty witnessed accelerating decline. Kings with forgettable names ruled over a realm that had become a shadow of Hammurabi's creation. The administrative records grow sparse, suggesting bureaucratic systems struggling to maintain coherence. Provincial governors operated with increasing autonomy, their loyalty to the throne becoming nominal rather than substantive. Then came the Hittites. In 1595, before the Common Era, King Mursili I led his army on an audacious campaign that covered over 1,000 kilometers from the Anatolian highlands. The Hittite forces descended the Euphrates with terrifying speed, bypassing fortified cities, driving toward Babylon itself. The raid was not conquest, but destruction, a lightning strike aimed at the heart of Mesopotamian civilization. The city fell. Hittite warriors breached walls that had stood for centuries, plundering temples whose treasuries had accumulated generations of offerings. The statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, was carried away as spoil, a theological catastrophe that left the city spiritually bereft. The great ziggurat stood silent, its god absent, its rituals impossible to perform. Mursili did not stay. The Hittites withdrew as quickly as they had come, leaving behind smoking ruins and a power vacuum that would reshape Mesopotamian politics. The first dynasty of Babylon ended not with gradual decline, but with sudden, violent termination. The Amorite line that had ruled for 3 centuries vanished from history, their palaces reduced to rubble, their administrative records scattered. Into this chaos came new peoples from the eastern mountains, the Kassites, who had been filtering into Babylonia as laborers and mercenaries for generations, recognized opportunity in catastrophe. They would rebuild what the Hittites had destroyed, establishing a dynasty that would endure 4 centuries and preserve Babylonian culture through its darkest hour. The mountain people descended into the ruined plains. From the Zagros highlands, where cold winds swept through pine forests and goat herds grazed on rocky slopes, the Kassites had watched Babylonian civilization for generations. They had served as laborers in Mesopotamian fields, as mercenaries in Babylonian armies, as craftsmen in provincial towns. Now, with the Hittite storm receded and the Amorite dynasty extinguished, they claimed the shattered throne for themselves. Agum II established Kassite authority over Babylon around 1590 before the Common Era. The transition proved remarkably smooth. These foreign rulers understood that Babylon's power resided not in military might alone, but in accumulated wisdom, administrative sophistication, and religious prestige. Rather than imposing highland customs upon the conquered population, the Kassites became more Babylonian than the Babylonians themselves. The new dynasty adopted Akkadian as their official language, abandoning their native Kassite tongue for court documents and royal inscriptions. They worshipped Marduk with fervent devotion, rebuilding his temples and enriching his priesthood. They preserved cuneiform scholarship, patronizing scribal schools where ancient texts were copied, studied, and transmitted to future generations. The Kassite centuries became an age of cultural conservation rather than innovation, a long twilight during which Babylonian civilization was carefully maintained against the erosions of time. Diplomatic correspondence flourished as never before. Clay tablets discovered at Amarna in Egypt reveal Kassite Babylon engaged in sophisticated international relations with the great powers of the late Bronze Age. Pharaohs exchanged gold for Babylonian horses and lapis lazuli. Hittite kings negotiated marriages and trade agreements. Assyrian rulers, still subordinate powers during this era, sought Babylonian recognition and cultural legitimacy. Babylon had lost military supremacy, but retained intellectual and religious authority that neighboring kingdoms eagerly sought. The Kassites introduced innovations of their own. Boundary stones called kudurus appeared throughout the realm, carved basalt monuments recording royal land grants with elaborate divine symbols protecting property rights across generations. These stones reveal a society obsessed with legal documentation, with establishing permanent records that would survive political upheaval. The trauma of the Hittite sack had taught harsh lessons about impermanence. Temple construction proceeded steadily. The Kassites rebuilt Esagila, Marduk's great sanctuary, and maintained the ziggurat Edamananki that would later inspire biblical accounts of the Tower of Babel. Provincial temples received royal attention, binding the realm together through shared religious observance. Priests accumulated unprecedented influence, their institutions becoming repositories of astronomical knowledge, medical texts, and mathematical treatises that represented humanity's most advanced learning. Trade networks expanded across the ancient world. Babylonian merchants carried cuneiform tablets recording transactions in copper, tin, textiles, and precious stones. Kassite seals appeared in distant markets, their distinctive designs marking goods that traveled from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. Babylon became a commercial crossroads where Egyptian gold met Afghan lapis lazuli, where Anatolian silver purchased Indian spices. Yet, shadows gathered at the edges. The Assyrians to the north grew increasingly powerful, their military innovations creating armies that would eventually dominate the entire Near East. Elamite kingdoms to the east nursed ancient grievances, waiting for moments of Babylonian weakness. The international system that sustained Kassite prosperity began fracturing around 1200 before the Common Era, as mysterious catastrophes swept the eastern Mediterranean. The dynasty endured 4 centuries, longer than any other Babylonian ruling house. 36 kings maintained the throne through invasion, rebellion, and natural disaster. Their persistence testified to institutional resilience rather than individual brilliance. The Kassites had created a stable system that could survive mediocre rulers and external pressures alike. The end came from the east. Elamite armies under Shutruk-Nahunte invaded around 1158 before the Common Era, sacking Babylon with devastating thoroughness. They carried away treasures accumulated over centuries, including the original stele bearing Hammurabi's law code, which archaeologists would eventually discover in the Elamite capital of Susa. The Kassite dynasty collapsed, but the civilization they had preserved would survive even this catastrophe. The knowledge survived because scribes refused to let it perish. In temple schools across Babylonia during the centuries following Kassite consolidation, young men bent over clay tablets, pressing wedge-shaped reeds into wet surfaces with meticulous precision. These scholars inherited astronomical observations stretching back generations, and they would transform raw data into systematic science. The scribal academies operated within temple complexes, where Marduk and Shamash received daily offerings. Students arrived as children, spending years mastering the hundreds of cuneiform signs required for basic literacy before advancing to specialized training. Mathematics and astronomy represented the highest intellectual achievements, reserved for the most capable minds. The curriculum demanded memorization of multiplication tables, reciprocal calculations, and geometric formulas passed down through centuries of accumulated wisdom. Babylonian mathematics operated on a base 60 system that modern civilization still employs without conscious recognition. Every hour divided into 60 minutes, every minute into 60 seconds, every circle into 360 degrees. These measurements originated in Mesopotamian scribal schools, where students calculated using positions rather than symbols for each number. The place value system allowed complex calculations impossible with cruder methods. Scribes could compute square roots, solve quadratic equations, and calculate areas of irregular shapes with remarkable accuracy. The astronomical tablets from this period reveal systematic observation spanning generations. Scribes recorded planetary movements, lunar phases, and stellar positions with obsessive regularity. They tracked Venus through its 8-year cycle, noting when the morning star disappeared below the horizon and reappeared as evening star. These observations served practical purposes. Agricultural timing, religious festivals, and royal prognostication all depended on celestial knowledge. The Mul-Apin tablets compiled star catalogs organizing the heavens into recognizable patterns. Babylonian astronomers identified constellations along the ecliptic path, creating the zodiacal system that would eventually reach Greek astronomers and persist into modern astrology. They calculated the length of the solar year with precision approaching modern measurements, understanding that 12 lunar months fell short of the seasonal cycle and required periodic intercalation. Eclipse prediction represented the pinnacle of Babylonian astronomical achievement. Through centuries of recorded observations, scribes identified the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, after which lunar and solar eclipses repeated in similar patterns. This knowledge transformed celestial events from terrifying divine omens into predictable phenomena. Kings could prepare for eclipses, performing rituals to avert ill fortune, while demonstrating their connection to cosmic order. The libraries accumulated clay tablets by the thousands. Scribes copied older texts onto fresh clay, preserving knowledge against the inevitable deterioration of individual tablets. They organized collections by subject, creating catalogs that allowed future scholars to locate specific information. Medical texts described symptoms and treatments. Omen collections interpreted everything from animal behavior to birth defects. Literary works preserved epic poetry and mythological narratives. Mathematical problem texts reveal pedagogical methods. Teachers posed practical scenarios, calculating the volume of grain storage, determining the labor required for canal excavation, computing interest on commercial loans. Students worked through standardized problems, learning techniques applicable to administrative challenges they would face as professional scribes serving temples, palaces, and merchant houses. The astronomical diaries began systematic daily recording during this era. Scribes noted weather conditions, river levels, commodity prices, and celestial observations in continuous logs spanning years and eventually centuries. This unprecedented data collection created archives that later astronomers would mine for patterns invisible within single lifetimes. Knowledge flowed outward from Babylonian centers. Scribes trained in Mesopotamian methods carried their expertise to peripheral regions. The mathematical and astronomical traditions would eventually reach Greek scholars who acknowledged their Babylonian debts while building upon inherited foundations. The science born between the rivers would illuminate Mediterranean civilization and ultimately shape modern understanding of the cosmos. The darkness descended gradually, then all at once. When Elamite forces sacked Babylon in 1155 before the Common Era, carrying the statue of Marduk eastward into captivity, they shattered more than stone and gold. They broke the spiritual covenant between city and God, leaving Babylonians to wonder whether divine favor had abandoned them entirely. The Kassite dynasty collapsed within years, and Babylon entered 5 centuries of diminished sovereignty that would test whether civilization could survive without political independence. The second dynasty of Isin emerged from the chaos, producing kings who fought desperately to restore Babylonian prestige. Nebuchadnezzar I achieved the impossible around 1125 before the Common Era, launching a daring campaign into Elam during summer heat so intense that horses collapsed and chariot axles cracked. Against all expectation, his forces recovered Marduk's statue, returning the god to his rightful temple. Poets composed the Enuma Elish creation epic during this period, elevating Marduk above all other deities, transforming local patron into cosmic king. The theological innovation reflected political desperation. If Babylon could not dominate through armies, perhaps divine supremacy might preserve its cultural centrality. Yet military weakness invited predators. Aramaean tribes swept through the river valleys during the 11th and 10th centuries before the Common Era, disrupting trade routes and isolating cities. Babylon shrank inward, its influence contracting to the immediate hinterland, while nomadic peoples controlled the countryside. Royal inscriptions from this era grow sparse, suggesting literacy itself retreated as economic networks collapsed. Then came Assyria. The Northern Empire had learned from Babylon for centuries, adopting cuneiform, worshipping similar gods, building ziggurats in imitation of Southern models. Now, the student surpassed the teacher in the arts of war. Assyrian kings developed professional standing armies equipped with iron weapons, siege engines, and cavalry tactics that overwhelmed traditional Mesopotamian warfare. By the 9th century before the Common Era, Assyrian campaigns regularly penetrated Babylonian territory, extracting tribute and humiliating ancient dynasties. The relationship between conqueror and conquered proved peculiarly complex. Assyrian kings genuinely revered Babylonian culture, viewing themselves as protectors rather than destroyers of civilization's heartland. They restored temples, patronized scribes, and sought legitimacy through Babylonian religious ceremonies. Tiglath-Pileser III formalized this arrangement around 745 before the Common Era, assuming direct rule over Babylon while maintaining separate royal identities for each realm. The fiction preserved Babylonian dignity while ensuring Assyrian control. Babylonians refused passive acceptance. Rebellions erupted repeatedly, led by local nobles and Chaldean tribal chiefs from the southern marshlands. Merodach Baladan twice seized the Babylonian throne, forging alliances with Elam against Assyrian overlords. Each revolt brought devastating retaliation. Sennacherib frustrated by endless resistance, ordered Babylon's complete destruction in 689 before the Common Era. His armies razed temples, diverted canals to flood the ruins, and carried away sacred soil. The act shocked the ancient world. Even Assyrians considered it sacrilege against civilization itself. Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, spent his reign rebuilding what his father destroyed, recognizing that Assyrian legitimacy required Babylonian sanctification. The Reconstruction employed thousands of workers, restoring Esagila temple and urban infrastructure. Yet the memory of destruction festered, nurturing resentment that would eventually consume Assyria entirely. Throughout these dark centuries, scribes preserved knowledge with quiet determination. Temple libraries continued copying ancient texts, maintaining astronomical observations, teaching mathematical traditions to new generations. The very persistence of learning became an act of cultural resistance, ensuring that Babylonian wisdom would outlast Babylonian independence. When opportunity finally arrived, the intellectual infrastructure remained intact, ready to support revival. The rebellion ignited in 626 before the Common Era, when a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar seized Babylon itself. The circumstances of his rise remain partially obscured by fragmentary records, but the outcome transformed Mesopotamian history irrevocably. Assyria, weakened by decades of civil war and overextension, could not immediately crush this southern uprising. The empire that had dominated the ancient world for 3 centuries suddenly faced an existential threat from the very city it had repeatedly humiliated. Nabopolassar understood that military victory alone would not secure independence. He cultivated Babylonian religious institutions with calculated devotion, presenting himself as Marduk's chosen instrument of liberation. Temple records describe elaborate rituals where the new king prostrated himself before divine statues, seeking legitimacy through sacred sanction. The priesthoods, remembering Sennacherib's desecration and generations of Assyrian contempt, embraced this Chaldean warrior as their champion. The early campaigns proved difficult. Assyrian forces counterattacked repeatedly, and Nabopolassar suffered setbacks that threatened his fragile kingdom. Yet each year brought new advantages. Assyria's northern frontiers crumbled under pressure from Scythian raiders and Median expansion. The empire that had terrorized nations now found itself besieged from multiple directions simultaneously. The decisive alliance formed around 616 before the Common Era. Cyaxares, king of the Medes, recognized that Assyria's destruction required coordinated assault. Babylonian and Median forces agreed to partition the dying empire, with Babylon claiming Mesopotamian territories while Media absorbed northern highlands. This diplomatic arrangement, sealed through royal marriage, created an unstoppable military combination. Ashur fell in 614 before the Common Era. The ancient Assyrian religious capital, sacred for millennia, succumbed to combined Babylonian and Median assault. The destruction proved systematic and thorough, erasing temples and palaces that had witnessed Assyrian glory. Nabopolassar's inscriptions celebrate this conquest with barely contained triumph, describing divine vengeance finally achieved. Nineveh's siege began in 612 before the Common Era. The greatest city in the world, protected by massive walls and sophisticated defenses, faced enemies who had learned patience from centuries of subjugation. The Tigris River, swollen by unusual flooding, reportedly breached portions of the fortifications. Combined forces poured through the gaps, overwhelming defenders who had grown accustomed to victory. The fall of Nineveh in 612 before the Common Era sent shockwaves across the ancient world. Prophets in distant Jerusalem celebrated Assyrian destruction as divine judgment. Egyptian pharaohs, who had alternately fought and allied with Assyria, suddenly faced a transformed geopolitical landscape. The empire that had seemed eternal vanished within a generation, its magnificent palaces reduced to burning ruins. Assyrian remnants fled westward, establishing a final stronghold at Haran under Egyptian protection. Nabopolassar pursued relentlessly, capturing Haran in 610 before the Common Era. The last Assyrian king disappeared from historical records, his fate unknown. An empire that had dominated the Near East for 300 years ceased to exist entirely. Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar commanded Babylonian forces during the final campaigns, gaining military experience that would later prove invaluable. At Carchemish in 605 before the Common Era, Babylonian armies crushed Egyptian forces attempting to restore Assyrian power. This victory established Babylonian supremacy over the Levant, opening pathways to Mediterranean expansion. Nabopolassar died in 605 before the Common Era, having accomplished what seemed impossible. A Chaldean tribal leader had destroyed the mightiest empire the world had known, restored Babylonian independence after centuries of subjugation, and positioned his dynasty to inherit Assyrian dominions. The Neo-Babylonian Empire emerged from rebellion's flames, ready to achieve glories that would echo through millennia. The crown prince rode hard through desert darkness, racing death itself. When messengers reached Nebuchadnezzar at Carchemish with news of his father's passing in 605 before the Common Era, the young commander faced a critical choice. Egyptian forces lay scattered, but not destroyed. Babylonian troops awaited orders for continued pursuit. Yet the throne in distant Babylon sat empty, and ambitious rivals might seize opportunity from tragedy. Nebuchadnezzar chose speed over caution. Leaving his army under trusted generals, he crossed the Syrian desert by the shortest route, covering distances that normally required weeks in mere days. This desperate journey revealed the prince's understanding of power's fragile nature. Legitimacy required presence. A throne claimed from afar invited challenge. He reached Babylon before opposition could crystallize. Within 3 weeks of Nabopolassar's death, Nebuchadnezzar sat upon the royal seat, receiving oaths of loyalty from priests, nobles, and military commanders. The transition proceeded with remarkable smoothness, testament to both careful succession planning and the new king's established reputation as a proven warrior. The young monarch inherited an empire still expanding. Assyrian territories remained partially unconsolidated. Egyptian influence persisted along Mediterranean coastlines. Syrian city-states wavered between submission and resistance. Nebuchadnezzar understood that military momentum, once lost, proved difficult to regain. Within months of his coronation, he returned to campaign. The Levantine expeditions between 604 and 597 before the Common Era established patterns that would define Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Each year, Babylonian armies marched westward after harvest season, extracting tribute, punishing rebellion, and demonstrating imperial reach. These campaigns combined calculated brutality with strategic patience. Cities that submitted received relatively lenient treatment. Those that resisted faced siege, destruction, and deportation. Egyptian interference complicated Levantine control. Pharaoh Necho II, despite his defeat at Carchemish, continued supporting anti-Babylonian coalitions among Syrian and Palestinian kingdoms. This Egyptian shadow encouraged resistance, forcing Nebuchadnezzar into repeated campaigns that drained resources and delayed consolidation. The clash came in 601 before the Common Era, when Babylonian and Egyptian forces met in open battle near the Egyptian frontier. Unlike Carchemish's decisive victory, this engagement proved costly and inconclusive. Both armies suffered severe casualties. Nebuchadnezzar withdrew to Babylon for rebuilding, spending the following year reorganizing his forces rather than campaigning. This pause emboldened subject kingdoms. Judah, under King Jehoiakim, stopped paying tribute, gambling that Egyptian protection would shield them from Babylonian retaliation. Other Levantine states watched carefully, calculating whether Babylon's power had peaked. Nebuchadnezzar's response demonstrated the strategic patience that distinguished his reign. Rather than immediate punitive expedition, he waited until his army recovered full strength. When Babylonian forces finally marched against Judah in 598 before the Common Era, they came prepared for extended siege rather than quick raid. Jehoiakim died during the crisis, leaving his young son Jehoiachin to face Babylonian wrath. After 3 months of siege, Jerusalem surrendered in 597 before the Common Era. Nebuchadnezzar's terms proved severe but calculated. The king, royal family, court officials, skilled craftsmen, and military elite were deported to Babylon. Temple treasures filled Babylonian coffers. Yet, the city itself survived, and a puppet king named Zedekiah received the throne under strict Babylonian oversight. This first Jerusalem campaign established Nebuchadnezzar's preferred method of imperial control. Deportation removed potential resistance leaders while enriching Babylon with skilled labor. Puppet rulers maintained administrative continuity while acknowledging Babylonian supremacy. The approach proved more sustainable than simple destruction, creating networks of dependency rather than wastelands of resentment. By 597 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar had transformed from crown prince to undisputed master of the Near East. His kingdom stretched from Persian Gulf marshlands to Mediterranean shores. Tribute flowed from dozens of subject peoples. The young king who had raced across deserts to claim his inheritance now commanded the greatest empire since Assyria's fall. Yet the peace proved fragile as desert sand. Zedekiah, the puppet king Nebuchadnezzar had installed upon Judah's throne, began listening to Egyptian whispers. Pharaoh Apries promised military support against Babylonian dominion, and the vassal king's loyalty wavered like flame in wind. By 589 before the Common Era, Zedekiah had ceased tribute payments and opened negotiations with Egypt, gambling his kingdom on foreign promises. Nebuchadnezzar's response came with terrible swiftness. Babylonian forces swept westward in 588, systematically reducing Judean fortifications. Archaeological evidence from Lachish reveals the campaign's methodical brutality. Clay tablets discovered in the ruins preserve desperate messages between garrison commanders, their cuneiform scratches documenting the progressive isolation of Jerusalem as surrounding cities fell one by one. The siege began in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign. Babylonian engineers constructed siege works around Jerusalem's walls, cutting supply lines and water sources. Inside the city, famine spread through narrow streets where children weakened and elders perished. The siege lasted 18 months, a slow strangulation that reduced the population to eating leather and worse. Egyptian forces did march northward, briefly lifting Babylonian pressure. Hope flickered through Jerusalem's starving quarters. But Nebuchadnezzar's generals merely pivoted, driving Apries back toward the Nile before returning to complete their work. The Egyptian intervention had only prolonged suffering without changing the outcome. In the 11th year, during the 4th month, Babylonian sappers breached Jerusalem's northern wall. Zedekiah fled through southern gates under cover of darkness, racing toward the Jordan Valley with his household guard. Babylonian cavalry overtook the fugitives near Jericho, capturing the rebel king and his sons. Nebuchadnezzar, commanding from his headquarters at Riblah in Syria, pronounced judgment. Zedekiah's sons were executed before their father's eyes, then those eyes were put out. The blinded king traveled to Babylon in chains, vanishing from historical record. 1 month after the breach, Nebuzaradan, captain of Nebuchadnezzar's guard, entered Jerusalem to complete its destruction. His soldiers systematically dismantled Solomon's temple, stripping gold from its walls, bronze from its pillars, silver from its vessels. The sacred objects that had stood for nearly 4 centuries were loaded onto carts bound for Babylon. Then fire consumed what remained. The destruction extended beyond the temple. Jerusalem's walls were torn down, its palaces burned, its administrative buildings razed. The city that had defied Babylonian authority twice would not receive a third opportunity. Archaeological excavations reveal ash layers and collapsed structures dating precisely to this destruction, physical testimony to the biblical account. The deportations that followed exceeded previous removals. Nebuzaradan gathered craftsmen, soldiers, priests, and nobles, anyone whose skills or influence might spark future rebellion. Only the poorest farmers remained, left to tend vineyards and fields that now belonged to Babylon. Estimates suggest between 15,000 and 20,000 Judeans made the long march eastward, joining earlier deportees in Babylonian territory. These exiles settled along irrigation canals near Nippur in communities that preserved their identity through centuries of displacement. They carried no temple, no king, no independent state, only their traditions, their texts, and their memories. In Babylonian captivity, Judaism transformed from a temple-centered religion into something portable, something that could survive without sacred geography. The synagogue emerged as an institution. Scripture became central. The exile that Nebuchadnezzar intended as punishment became the crucible that forged a faith capable of surviving any diaspora. Babylon absorbed its captives into a cosmopolitan empire. Judean names appear in administrative tablets, recording rations distributed to exiled royalty, documenting craftsmen employed in construction projects. The conquered became contributors, their skills enriching the very power that had destroyed their homeland. Nebuchadnezzar had eliminated a persistent source of rebellion and demonstrated the cost of defiance. Jerusalem's smoking ruins sent unmistakable messages to other vassals contemplating Egyptian alliances. The empire's western frontier stabilized through terror and deportation, methods brutal but effective by ancient standards. The temple treasures reached Babylon, where they joined accumulated wealth from conquered peoples across the Near East. Sacred vessels that had held offerings to Yahweh now rested in Marduk's treasury, trophies of imperial supremacy. The treasures of Jerusalem had barely found their place in Marduk's vaults when Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to transformation of a different kind. The empire's wealth now demanded expression in stone and glazed brick, in sacred architecture that would proclaim Babylonian supremacy to every visitor who passed through its gates. Construction had already begun during the conquest years, but the 590 before the Common Era marked an acceleration of ambition. The northern approach to Babylon, where the processional way entered the city through its most sacred gate, became the focus of unprecedented building activity. Thousands of laborers worked in organized shifts, their efforts coordinated by architects whose plans survive on clay tablets recovered from palace archives. The gate dedicated to Ishtar, goddess of love and war, rose in stages that demonstrated mastery over materials and mathematics alike. The structure employed a double gate design, with an outer entrance leading to an interior courtyard before the main passage. Walls towered nearly 40 feet high, their cores built from sun-dried mud brick, but their faces covered in something revolutionary. Glazed brick technology had existed for centuries, but Babylonian craftsmen perfected techniques that transformed architectural surfaces into fields of brilliant color. The process required precise control of kiln temperatures, careful preparation of mineral pigments, and understanding of how different compounds behaved under extreme heat. Lapis lazuli blue dominated the palette, achieved through copper-based glazes that produced deep azure surfaces unlike anything the ancient world had witnessed. Against this celestial blue background, artisans created relief sculptures of sacred animals. Dragons representing Marduk alternated with bulls sacred to Adad, the storm god. Lions associated with Ishtar prowled along the processional way itself, their forms built from individually molded bricks that fit together like puzzle pieces. Each creature required hundreds of separate brick elements, each fired with its own specific glaze color, each positioned according to master plans that ensured anatomical accuracy across massive surfaces. The technical achievement staggered comprehension. Modern analysis reveals that craftsmen produced over 15,000 glazed bricks for the Ishtar Gate alone, with the processional way requiring tens of thousands more. Quality control maintained remarkable consistency across production batches, suggesting standardized workshop practices and rigorous inspection protocols. The processional way stretched over half a mile from the gate toward the Asagala temple complex, its walls lined with 60 lions in glazed relief. The road surface itself consisted of limestone slabs imported from distant quarries, each stone fitted precisely against its neighbors. Beneath the pavement, drainage channels carried rainwater away from the sacred route, preventing flooding that might disrupt religious processions. These processions defined the architecture's purpose. During the New Year festival, statues of Marduk and visiting deities traveled this route in elaborate ceremonies that renewed cosmic order. The glazed walls transformed the journey into passage through sacred space, where divine images surrounded worshippers with protective power. The lions seemed to guard the way, the dragons proclaimed Marduk's supremacy. The bulls invoked storm god blessing upon those who walked between them. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions, stamped into bricks throughout the construction, proclaimed his devotion and his achievements. The king presented himself as humble servant of the gods, building for their glory rather than his own. Yet the inscriptions also cataloged conquests and tribute, reminding viewers that divine favor manifested through military victory and imperial expansion. The gate complex included administrative structures, guard chambers, and storage facilities that served practical functions alongside sacred ones. Babylon's northern entrance controlled access to the city's most important religious precinct, requiring security measures appropriate to protecting divine residences. The architecture combined defensive capability with ceremonial grandeur, walls thick enough to resist siege, yet beautiful enough to inspire awe. Beyond the gate, the inner city revealed itself in stages, the processional way continued past palace complexes where Nebuchadnezzar conducted state business, past residential quarters where priests and officials maintained households, toward the temple district where Marduk dwelt in his earthly home. The construction consumed resources from across the empire. Cedar beams from Lebanon supported roofing structures. Bitumen from natural seeps waterproofed foundations. Copper and tin arrived from distant mines to create bronze fittings. The gate became a monument to imperial reach, its materials testifying to Babylon's ability to command tribute from every direction. The gardens existed, or perhaps they never did. This mystery haunts Babylon more than any other, for no contemporary Babylonian text mentions the hanging gardens that Greek writers would later celebrate as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Yet, something extraordinary rose within Nebuchadnezzar's palace complex during these decades, something that captured imaginations across centuries and civilizations. The palace grounds expanded dramatically between 580 and 560 before the Common Era. Nebuchadnezzar's southern palace grew into a labyrinthine complex of 5 major courtyards, each serving distinct administrative and ceremonial functions. Throne rooms featured glazed brick decorations rivaling the Ishtar Gate itself. Storage magazines held tribute from conquered territories. Administrative offices processed the endless paperwork of empire. Within this complex, archaeologists discovered something unusual. A vaulted structure of 14 chambers, arranged in 2 rows, featured stone construction rather than typical mud brick. Stone was precious in Mesopotamia, imported at great expense. This basement structure also contained a well system with 3 shafts positioned to operate a chain pump mechanism, capable of lifting water to considerable heights. The engineering challenges of elevated gardens in Mesopotamian climate were immense. Water evaporated rapidly under relentless sun. Soil weight stressed any elevated structure. Root systems required waterproofing to prevent structural damage. Yet, Babylonian engineers had mastered irrigation for millennia, channeling the Euphrates through complex canal networks that transformed desert into farmland. The chain pump technology, if employed, represented sophisticated mechanical engineering. Buckets attached to an endless chain could lift water continuously when workers turned a wheel mechanism. Similar devices appeared in later Hellenistic engineering, suggesting possible Babylonian origins. Water raised to elevated terraces could then flow through channels, creating the cascading effect that later writers described. Greek accounts, written centuries after Babylon's fall, described terraces rising like a theater, supported by stone columns, planted with trees whose roots were protected by layers of reeds, bitumen, and lead sheeting. Diodorus Siculus claimed the gardens measured 400 feet on each side, rising to heights matching city walls. Strabo mentioned a screw mechanism for raising water, anticipating the Archimedean screw by centuries. Some scholars now propose the gardens existed not in Babylon, but in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, where documented royal gardens featured elaborate irrigation systems. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe raising water to great heights using bronze screws, watering gardens planted on artificial mountains. Perhaps Greek writers confused the 2 cities, attributing Assyrian achievements to more famous Babylon. Yet, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Babylonian royal inscriptions focused on temple construction and military victories, not palace amenities. The gardens, if they existed, may simply have seemed unremarkable to scribes accustomed to elaborate royal grounds. Only foreign visitors, unaccustomed to such engineering, might have found them worthy of wonder. The palace complex certainly contained extensive gardens at ground level. Excavations revealed elaborate drainage systems, planting beds, and water channels throughout royal precincts. Trees provided shade in courtyards. Flowering plants perfumed administrative quarters. The distinction between ordinary palace gardens and legendary hanging gardens may be one of scale and elevation rather than existence itself. Nebuchadnezzar's building inscriptions speak of creating mountain-like structures, of planting trees that cast shadows like forests. These descriptions suggest elevated plantings, though perhaps not the theatrical terraces Greek imagination later constructed. The truth likely lies somewhere between complete fabrication and literal wonder, in gardens impressive enough to inspire legend yet modest enough to escape detailed documentation. The mystery endures precisely because it captures something essential about Babylon itself. This was a civilization that bent nature to human will, that made rivers flow where engineers commanded, that raised towers toward heaven. Whether the hanging gardens existed exactly as described matters less than what they represent. Humanity's eternal desire to create paradise on earth, to make the impossible bloom in hostile environments. And paradise on earth required divine blessing. In the decades following 570 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar directed his empire's vast resources toward the gods themselves, transforming Babylon into the most sacred city the ancient world had ever witnessed. At the city's heart stood Esagila, the temple of Marduk, whose name meant house whose top is high. This was no ordinary sanctuary, but the spiritual axis around which all Mesopotamian religion revolved. The temple complex sprawled across acres of sacred ground, its courtyards paved with baked brick, its chambers lined with cedar imported from distant Lebanon. Gold leaf covered the inner sanctum where Marduk's cult statue resided, a figure so precious that its exact appearance remained a closely guarded mystery to all but the highest priests. The rituals performed within Esagila followed patterns established across millennia. Each morning, priests bathed and dressed the divine statue as though Marduk himself inhabited the golden form. They presented meals of roasted meats, fresh bread, dates, and beer, setting elaborate tables before the god, while incense smoke carried prayers toward heaven. The food, once blessed by divine presence, was later distributed to temple personnel, creating an economy of sacred sustenance that fed thousands. Rising beside Esagila stood Etemenanki, the ziggurat whose name proclaimed it, the foundation of heaven and earth. This step tower climbed toward the sky in 7 ascending stages, each painted a different color, representing celestial bodies known to Babylonian astronomers. The base measured nearly 90 meters on each side, while the summit reached perhaps the same height, though erosion and later destruction make precise measurements impossible. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Etemenanki with obsessive attention, leaving inscriptions describing his work in terms of cosmic duty. The tower's core consisted of sun-dried mud brick, millions of individual blocks formed by countless laborers. The outer facing used fired brick set in bitumen, creating a waterproof shell that protected the earth and heart from Mesopotamian rains. Staircases wound upward through the structure, allowing priests to ascend toward the small temple crowning the summit where the most sacred rituals occurred. The religious calendar governed all Babylonian life. The New Year festival, celebrated each spring during the month of Nisanu, brought the entire empire's attention to Babylon. For 11 days, elaborate ceremonies reenacted cosmic creation, with the king himself playing a central role. On the fifth day, the monarch entered Esagila, where priests stripped him of royal regalia, struck his face, and forced him to kneel before Marduk's statue. Only after declaring his innocence and devotion was kingship restored, a ritual humiliation reminding even the most powerful ruler that divine authority superseded earthly power. Processions moved through the city along the sacred way, carrying Marduk's statue from Esagila through the Ishtar Gate to a special festival temple outside the walls. Thousands lined the route, watching their god travel in splendor while musicians played and incense perfumed the air. These ceremonies reinforced Babylon's position as the universe's spiritual center, the place where heaven touched earth. Temples throughout the city served lesser deities, each with dedicated priests, rituals, and economic functions. Ishtar, Shamash, Nabu, and dozens of other gods maintained households within Babylon's walls. These temples owned vast agricultural lands, employed armies of workers, and conducted banking operations that made them economic powerhouses alongside their spiritual roles. The priesthood itself formed a hereditary caste, with sacred knowledge passing from father to son across generations. Young priests memorized ancient texts, learned astronomical calculations, and mastered divination techniques that allowed them to read divine will in sheep livers, oil patterns on water, and celestial movements. This knowledge made temples indispensable to royal decision-making, for no king would launch a campaign or begin construction without favorable omens. In these sacred precincts, Babylon achieved something remarkable, a complete integration of religion, government, economy, and knowledge that made the city function as a single divine organism, with Marduk's blessing flowing through every transaction and every breath. Beyond the temple precincts, where incense smoke gave way to cooking fires and the chanting of priests yielded to the calls of vendors, ordinary Babylon stirred with the rhythms of daily existence. In the years between 560 and 540 before the Common Era, the city Nebuchadnezzar had transformed into a wonder of the world, functioned as home to perhaps 200,000 souls, each navigating streets that had witnessed centuries of human striving. The residential quarters spread outward from the sacred center in a maze of narrow lanes and mud brick houses. Wealthy merchants occupied two-story dwellings with interior courtyards where date palms provided shade and clay pipes carried water from the Euphrates. Their walls, plastered white against the summer heat, enclosed rooms arranged around central spaces where families gathered, children played, and servants prepared meals over clay ovens. Poorer residents crowded into single-room structures along winding alleys barely wide enough for two people to pass, their rooftops serving as sleeping quarters during the brutal summer months when temperatures made indoor rest impossible. The markets of Babylon pulsed with commercial energy unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. Along the canal banks, merchants displayed goods from every corner of the known earth: cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, textiles from Egypt, spices from Arabia. Babylonian traders had perfected commercial practices that would echo through millennia. They wrote contracts on clay tablets, specified delivery dates, established penalties for breach, and created the legal frameworks that made long-distance trade possible. Craftsmen organized themselves into hereditary guilds that controlled production and maintained quality standards. Bronze workers hammered vessels and tools in workshops where the ring of metal against metal never ceased. Weavers produced textiles on wooden looms, their fingers moving with practiced speed through wool and linen threads. Potters shaped clay on wheels that spun with hypnotic regularity, creating everything from massive storage jars to delicate drinking vessels. Jewelers worked gold and silver into intricate designs, setting precious stones in patterns that adorned the wealthy and honored the gods. The brewing of beer occupied a special place in Babylonian life. Women typically managed this essential craft, producing the thick, nutritious beverage that served as both sustenance and social lubricant. Taverns lined the commercial streets, their proprietresses serving customers through long straws inserted into communal vessels. These establishments functioned as gathering places where deals were struck, gossip exchanged, and the exhaustions of daily labor temporarily forgotten. Food vendors worked from dawn until well past sunset, offering roasted meats, fresh bread, dates, figs, and the countless preparations that Babylonian cuisine had developed over centuries. Fish from the rivers and canals provided protein for those who could not afford lamb or goat. Vegetables grown in irrigated gardens supplemented grain-based diets, while honey sweetened special occasion dishes. The legal system that Hammurabi had codified over 1,000 years earlier still governed daily interactions. Judges heard disputes in designated courts, consulting the ancient laws while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. Property transactions required witnesses and written documentation. Marriage contracts specified dowries, inheritance rights, and conditions for divorce. Even slaves possessed certain legal protections, their treatment regulated by traditions that recognized their humanity while accepting their bondage. Children learned their parents' trades, apprenticed to masters who would shape their futures. Boys destined for scribal careers entered temple schools, where they spent years mastering the hundreds of cuneiform signs necessary for literacy. Girls learned domestic skills from mothers and grandmothers, preparing for marriages that would be arranged according to family interests and social standing. As evening shadows lengthened across the processional way, the city's pace slowed but never stopped. Night watchmen patrolled the streets while taverns filled with workers seeking respite. Families gathered on rooftops to escape the day's accumulated heat, their conversations drifting across the urban landscape like whispered prayers. This was Babylon at its most human, not the city of kings and conquests, but the city of bakers and brewers, weavers and merchants, children and elders living lives shaped by rhythms older than memory itself. Yet even as ordinary Babylonians lived their timeless rhythms, the palace corridors grew heavy with whispered anxieties. In 562 before the Common Era, after 43 years upon the throne, Nebuchadnezzar II drew his final breath. The king who had rebuilt Babylon into humanity's greatest city, who had humbled Egypt and destroyed Jerusalem, who had raised the Ishtar Gate and perhaps the legendary gardens themselves, passed from the world of the living into the realm of ancestors. His son, Amel-Marduk, inherited an empire at its zenith, yet the new king proved ill-suited for the burden. Ancient sources speak of a reign marked by poor judgment and religious impropriety. Within 2 years, his own brother-in-law, Neriglissar, orchestrated his assassination, seizing the throne through palace conspiracy rather than divine mandate. The pattern of violent succession had begun. Neriglissar ruled competently for 4 years, conducting military campaigns in Cilicia and maintaining the empire's western frontiers. But when death claimed him in 556 before the Common Era, his young son, Labashi-Marduk, lasted mere months before nobles murdered the child king. 3 rulers had fallen in 6 years. The dynasty Nebuchadnezzar had glorified was consuming itself. From this chaos emerged the strangest figure in Babylonian history, Nabonidus, a nobleman from Haran with no blood connection to the royal line, somehow secured the throne. His mother Adad-Gupi had served as priestess to the moon god Sin, and this devotion shaped her son's peculiar reign. Where previous kings had honored Marduk as Babylon's supreme deity, Nabonidus elevated Sin above all others, alienating the powerful Marduk priesthood whose support legitimized royal authority. The new king's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He abandoned Babylon itself, retreating to the Arabian oasis of Tama for 10 consecutive years. The reasons remain debated. Some scholars suggest religious motivations, others point to trade route control, still others whisper of mental instability. Whatever drove this extraordinary absence, its consequences proved catastrophic. Without the king present, the crucial New Year festival could not be performed. Marduk's blessing went unsought. The cosmic order that Babylonian theology demanded remained ritually unfulfilled. In Babylon, Nabonidus' son Belshazzar administered daily governance, but a crown prince could not substitute for sacred kingship. The temples grew restive. The priesthood documented their grievances on clay tablets that archaeologists would later recover, cataloging royal neglect and religious deviation. The empire's spiritual foundations cracked, while its political structure remained outwardly intact. Meanwhile, beyond Mesopotamia's borders, a new power consolidated strength with terrifying efficiency. Cyrus of Persia had united the Medes and Persians, conquered wealthy Lydia, and absorbed the Greek cities of Anatolia. His empire now stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Iranian plateau, surrounding Babylon on multiple fronts. The final king of Babylon seemed oblivious to the gathering storm, lost in his desert devotions while destiny approached the gates his predecessors had built. The storm arrived in the autumn of 539, before the Common Era, moving with a precision that suggested divine orchestration. Cyrus of Persia had spent years preparing for this moment, his armies swelling with conquered peoples who now marched beneath Achaemenid banners. The greatest city on earth lay before him, its walls rising impossibly high, its defenses legendary throughout the ancient world. Those walls presented a formidable challenge. Nebuchadnezzar had constructed fortifications that seemed to mock any siege engine yet devised. The outer wall stretched 11 meters thick, reinforced by an inner wall of equal strength. Between them ran a moat fed by Euphrates waters, transforming Babylon into an island fortress. Towers punctuated the defenses at regular intervals, bristling with archers who could rain death upon any approaching army. Military logic suggested that Babylon could withstand siege for decades, its granaries overflowing with provisions, its wells drawing from inexhaustible aquifers. Cyrus understood that conventional assault meant catastrophic losses. His engineers studied the city's greatest strength and recognized it as vulnerability. The Euphrates River flowed directly through Babylon, entering beneath the northern walls and exiting through the south. Bronze gates sealed these water passages, preventing enemy infiltration. But water, unlike stone, could be redirected. Persian forces moved upstream during the festival of Akitu, when Babylonian attention focused on religious celebrations rather than military vigilance. Nabonidus remained absent in Tama, while his son Belshazzar commanded the capital's defense with the casual confidence of one who trusted in impregnable walls. The city's population feasted and drank, their revelry echoing through streets illuminated by torchlight. At the designated hour, Persian engineers breached the canal systems north of the city. The Euphrates waters, carefully channeled for millennia to sustain Babylonian agriculture, now flowed into hastily excavated diversion channels. The river level dropped steadily throughout the night, exposing muddy banks beneath the water gates that had protected Babylon for generations. Persian soldiers waded through the diminished current, their passage eerily silent beneath walls designed to repel armies, not infiltrators. The bronze gates that should have blocked their advance stood partially submerged in mud rather than water. One by one, units entered the sleeping city through passages that defenders had never imagined vulnerable. The conquest unfolded with surreal quietness. Persian forces secured key positions throughout Babylon before most inhabitants realized their city had fallen. Guards at the palace gates found themselves surrounded before they could raise alarm. The great temples of Marduk and Nabu passed into foreign hands without a single priest being harmed. Belshazzar died that night, though ancient sources disagree on circumstances. Some accounts describe brief resistance at the palace. Others suggest assassination by conspirators who had already negotiated with Cyrus. The details matter less than the outcome. Babylonian royal authority ended not in glorious last stands, but in confused midnight hours when empire slipped away like river water through open channels. Cyrus entered Babylon days later, presenting himself not as conqueror, but as liberator. His propaganda proved masterful, portraying Nabonidus as a heretic who had abandoned Marduk, while Cyrus claimed the great god had chosen him to restore proper worship. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered by archaeologists in 1879, recorded this narrative in cuneiform, declaring that Marduk himself had selected the Persian king to rule Babylon. The transition proved remarkably peaceful. Temples continued their rituals, merchants resumed their trade. Scribes recorded the change of dynasty with the same meticulous attention they had devoted to Babylonian kings. Life in the streets continued its eternal rhythms, barely disturbed by the Persian soldiers now patrolling familiar corners. Yet, something fundamental had ended. For over 1,000 years, Babylon had determined its own destiny, rising and falling under native dynasties who understood Mesopotamian traditions as birthright. Now, the city became a provincial capital, magnificent still, but subordinate to distant Persepolis. The Ishtar Gate still blazed with lapis lazuli. The ziggurats still pierced the heavens, but the power that had built them answered to foreign masters. Babylon's independence had vanished in a single autumn night. Foreign masters proved surprisingly gentle. The Achaemenid administration that settled over Babylon in the years following 539 before the Common Era displayed a sophistication that previous conquerors had lacked. Cyrus and his successors understood that crushing a city of such magnificence served no purpose. Better to harness its wealth, its learning, its ancient prestige for Persian glory. The great temples continued their rituals without interruption. Priests of Marduk still processed through the Ishtar Gate during the New Year festival, still recited the Enuma Elish in sacred chambers where incense smoke curled toward painted ceilings. Persian kings adopted Babylonian royal titles, participated in religious ceremonies, presented themselves as legitimate successors to Nebuchadnezzar's throne. Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, each took the hands of Marduk, each acknowledged the god's supremacy within his own city. Yet accommodation masked gradual erosion. The administrative language shifted slowly from Akkadian cuneiform to Aramaic script, written on parchment rather than clay. Scribal schools that had transmitted Mesopotamian learning for 2 millennia found fewer students. their ancient curriculum increasingly irrelevant to young men seeking careers in Persian bureaucracy. The clay tablets accumulated dust in temple libraries, while the living tradition that had created them withered. Economic patterns transformed as well. Babylon remained prosperous, its merchants still trading along routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. But the city no longer commanded these networks. Persepolis drew tribute that once flowed to Babylonian treasuries. The great building projects ceased. No new palaces rose. No fresh glazed bricks adorned processional ways. Maintenance replaced ambition. The population began its slow decline. Persian colonists settled in surrounding territories, their villages gradually absorbing Babylonian cultural practices while diluting the city's demographic dominance. Intermarriage blurred ethnic boundaries. The Aramaic language spread through markets and households, pushing Akkadian toward purely ceremonial functions. Children grew up speaking the tongue of commerce rather than the sacred language of their ancestors. Rebellions flared occasionally, desperate attempts to restore independence. In 484 before the Common Era, Babylon rose against Xerxes following his defeat in Greece. The Persian response proved devastating. Xerxes demolished portions of the Asagala temple, removed the golden statue of Marduk, and stripped the city of privileges it had enjoyed under earlier Achaemenid rulers. The ziggurat at Menanke fell into disrepair, its mud brick core slowly dissolving under winter rains that no one bothered to repair. The astronomical observations continued, perhaps the most remarkable survival of Babylonian civilization. Night after night, priests recorded celestial movements with the same precision their predecessors had maintained for centuries. These observations would eventually reach Greek astronomers, transmitting Mesopotamian mathematical sophistication to the Mediterranean world. The knowledge survived even as the culture that created it faded. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Babylon had become a museum of its former self. The Ishtar Gate still stood, its lapis lazuli lions weathered but magnificent. The processional way still stretched toward temples where diminished priesthoods maintained ancient rituals. Visitors marveled at the city's scale, its legendary associations, its crumbling grandeur. But the creative energy that had once made Babylon humanity's greatest city had long since departed. The Persian Empire itself grew old, its administration increasingly corrupt, its military effectiveness declining. Distant satraps governed with minimal oversight, from kings who rarely visited their Babylonian possession. The city waited, suspended between a glorious past and an uncertain future, its walls still formidable, but its spirit diminished beyond recognition. The waiting ended with thunder from the west. In 331, before the Common Era, a young Macedonian king swept across the ancient world with a velocity that defied comprehension. Alexander, son of Philip, had already shattered Persian armies at Granicus and Issus. Now he drove toward the empire's heart, and Babylon lay directly in his path. The city that had endured Cyrus 2 centuries earlier prepared to receive another conqueror. But this time, resistance seemed pointless. The Persian satrap Mazaeus, recognizing the futility of defending walls against an unstoppable force, chose surrender over destruction. As Alexander's army approached, Babylon's gates swung open in welcome rather than defiance. The Macedonian entered through the Ishtar Gate in October of that year, his cavalry clattering across stones that had witnessed Nebuchadnezzar's triumphal processions. The lapis lazuli lions, faded but still magnificent, gazed upon a new master. Alexander, barely 30 years old, rode beneath the same sacred bulls and dragons that had awed visitors for generations. The processional way, designed to humble approaching kings before Marduk's majesty, now served to glorify a foreign conqueror who claimed descent from gods. Yet Alexander proved no ordinary destroyer. Where other conquerors might have stripped temples and humiliated priests, the Macedonian displayed remarkable cultural sensitivity. He ordered sacrifices to Marduk according to ancient Babylonian rites. He commanded the restoration of Asagala, the great temple complex that Persian neglect had allowed to deteriorate. He consulted Babylonian astronomers whose star charts and mathematical precision impressed even Greek scholars accustomed to their own philosophical traditions. The city experienced a brief renaissance of hope. Craftsmen found employment in restoration projects. Priests resumed ceremonies with renewed vigor. Merchants anticipated prosperity as Babylon became the eastern capital of an empire stretching from Macedonia to India. Alexander's vision encompassed not destruction, but fusion, a blending of Greek and Eastern traditions with Babylon as its magnificent center. The young king departed for further conquests, pursuing Persian remnants into Central Asia, crossing into India, pushing his exhausted army to the edges of the known world. But Babylon remained in his thoughts. He envisioned the ancient city as his imperial capital, a place where Greek philosophy would merge with Babylonian astronomy, where Macedonian military discipline would combine with Eastern administrative sophistication. In 323 before the Common Era, Alexander returned. He entered Babylon despite warnings from Chaldean priests who had read ominous signs in the heavens. Their astronomical calculations, refined over millennia, suggested catastrophe awaited within those ancient walls. Alexander, who had conquered the world, dismissed such superstitions. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar received its final great king. Within those chambers where Babylonian monarchs had once planned conquests and administered vast territories, Alexander held court, received ambassadors, and planned future campaigns. Arabia beckoned, the Western Mediterranean awaited. His ambitions remained boundless, even as his body began to fail. In June of that year, fever seized the conqueror. For 11 days, Alexander lay dying in the palace that had witnessed Babylon's greatest glories. His generals gathered, watching the man who had reshaped the world slip toward death. When asked to whom he left his empire, tradition holds he whispered a single word, suggesting the strongest should inherit. Alexander died on the 11th of June, 323 before the Common Era. He was 32 years old. The palace that had housed Nebuchadnezzar's dreams now witnessed the extinction of another world-changing vision. Babylon had claimed one final king, not through conquest, but through the mysterious workings of fate and fever. The aftermath proved catastrophic for Alexander's unified vision. His generals, the Diadochi, immediately began dividing the empire among themselves. Babylon became a prize in their struggles, passing between competing warlords as they carved Alexander's conquests into rival kingdoms. Seleucus eventually secured Mesopotamia, founding a dynasty that would rule for centuries. But Seleucid attention focused elsewhere. A new capital, Seleucia, rose on the Tigris, deliberately drawing population and prestige away from ancient Babylon. The city that had survived Hittites, Kassites, Assyrians, and Persians now faced a more insidious threat than any conqueror's army. It faced irrelevance, the slow draining of vitality toward newer, more favored centers of power. The abandonment unfolded across centuries, a gradual hemorrhage of life rather than sudden death. Through the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, Babylon's population drained steadily towards Seleucia, that upstart city on the Tigris, where Seleucid kings lavished attention and resources. Merchants relocated their operations. Scribes sought patronage in newer courts. The great temples still functioned. Priests still performed ancient rituals, but the congregations thinned with each passing generation. By the 1st century before the Common Era, visitors described a city of magnificent ruins inhabited by scattered populations, clinging to ancestral neighborhoods. The Asagila temple complex maintained its rituals until approximately the 70s of that century, when the last cuneiform astronomical diary was inscribed. After nearly 3,000 years of continuous scholarly tradition, the scribes finally set down their reed styluses. The knowledge they had accumulated did not vanish entirely, having already spread through Greek and Persian intermediaries, but its living transmission ended in the very city where it began. The Parthian period witnessed further decay. Babylon became a provincial backwater, its remaining inhabitants concentrated in small settlements amid crumbling grandeur. The great walls that Nebuchadnezzar had built to withstand any army now sheltered only shepherds seeking shade for their flocks. Irrigation canals silted up without maintenance, and the surrounding farmland reverted to desert and marsh. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Babylon existed primarily as a quarry. Local populations stripped fired bricks from ancient structures, carrying away materials that had stood for millennia. The bitumen mortar that had held Nebuchadnezzar's constructions together proved valuable for new building projects elsewhere. Layer by layer, the physical city disappeared into the structures of successor settlements. Then came the sand. Mesopotamian winds carried fine particles that accumulated against every remaining wall, filling every depression, burying every fallen column. The Euphrates shifted its course, leaving the city's ancient harbor districts stranded far from water. What conquest and neglect had weakened, nature completed. By the medieval period, Babylon had vanished beneath mounds that local Arabs called tells, knowing only that ancient things lay buried within. Yet memory persisted. Biblical accounts preserved Babylon's name through centuries when its location remained uncertain. The Book of Daniel described Nebuchadnezzar's madness. Revelation transformed the city into a symbol of worldly corruption. Islamic scholars referenced Babylonian learning, while uncertain where the original city had stood. European travelers occasionally visited the mounds, speculating about their contents without systematic investigation. The 19th century brought transformation. In 1899, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began excavations that would continue for 18 years. His teams uncovered the Ishtar Gate's glazed bricks, the processional way's lion reliefs, the foundations of temples and palaces that had slumbered beneath Iraqi soil for 2 millennia. Cuneiform tablets emerged by the thousands, their wedge-shaped impressions preserving administrative records, astronomical observations, literary compositions, and legal documents. The excavations revealed a city far more sophisticated than legend had suggested. Drainage systems demonstrated advanced urban planning. Astronomical tablets showed mathematical precision that astonished modern scientists. The law code of Hammurabi, discovered at Susa, where Elamite raiders had carried it as plunder, proved that systematic jurisprudence predated Greek philosophy by over a millennium. Babylon rose from the sand not as myth, but as documented reality. Its achievements measurable, its innovations traceable through the archaeological record into the foundations of subsequent civilizations. The inheritance proves incalculable, woven so deeply into modern existence that its origins have become invisible. Every glance at a clock face, every geometric calculation, every legal principle governing human society carries within it the fingerprints of Babylonian innovation, transmitted across millennia through channels both direct and circuitous. The sexagesimal system, that elegant mathematical framework built upon the number 60, persists in the most fundamental measurements of human experience. 60 seconds compose each minute. 60 minutes form each hour. 360 degrees divide the circle. These are not arbitrary conventions, but Babylonian legacies, preserved through Greek transmission into Roman practice and onward into the universal standards of modern civilization. When astronomers calculate celestial positions or navigators plot courses across oceans, they employ mathematical structures first developed by scribes working in the shadow of Edamananke. The astronomical observations recorded on clay tablets achieved precision that modern instruments have verified. Babylonian scholars tracked the movements of planets with such accuracy that their eclipse predictions remained useful for centuries after the empire's fall. The zodiac, that belt of constellations through which the sun appears to travel, received its systematic organization from Babylonian astronomers who mapped the heavens with patient dedication across generations. Modern astrology, whatever its scientific merits, preserves Babylonian star lore in popular consciousness. The legal revolution initiated by Hammurabi's code established principles that echo through every courtroom on earth. The concept of written law, publicly displayed and universally applicable, transformed governance from arbitrary decree into systematic jurisprudence. The presumption of innocence, the requirement of evidence, the proportionality of punishment to offense, the protection of vulnerable populations through explicit legal provision, these innovations shaped the legal traditions of subsequent civilizations from Rome to the modern democratic state. Urban planning itself owes debts to Babylonian precedent. The grid street patterns, the zoning of commercial and residential districts, the integration of religious architecture with civic space, the engineering of drainage and water supply. These organizational principles developed in Mesopotamian cities informed urban design across the ancient world and continue influencing city planning today. The very concept of empire, of unified administration across diverse populations, of standardized weights and measures facilitating trade across vast distances, of diplomatic correspondence between sovereign powers. These political innovations emerged from Babylonian practice and shaped the imperial structures that followed, from Persia through Rome to the colonial powers of recent centuries. Writing itself, though invented by Sumerians, achieved its fullest early development in Babylonian hands. The scribal schools that trained generations of administrators created educational institutions whose organizational principles influenced academies from Alexandria to medieval monasteries to modern universities. The library tradition, the systematic collection and preservation of knowledge, found early expression in Babylonian tablet collections that prefigured the great libraries of subsequent ages. The agricultural techniques developed in Mesopotamian fields, the irrigation systems that transformed desert into garden, the crop rotation practices that sustained populations across millennia, these innovations spread throughout the ancient world and inform agricultural science today. The calendar systems that organize modern life trace their origins to Babylonian attempts to reconcile lunar months with solar years. Perhaps most profoundly, Babylon demonstrated that human beings could create something greater than themselves. That collective effort across generations could produce achievements beyond any individual capacity. The city that rose from mudflats to become humanity's first true metropolis proved that civilization itself was possible. That order could emerge from chaos. That beauty could be constructed from common earth. The ruins that archaeologists uncovered in the 19th century revealed not a lost world, but the foundations of the present one. Every modern city, with its laws and libraries, its temples and markets, its astronomical observatories and mathematical schools, carries within it the genetic code of Babylon, that ancient experiment in human organization whose success made all subsequent civilization conceivable. The gate of the gods has crumbled, but the passage it opened remains forever traversable. Thank you for journeying through the complete history of Babylon with us. If you found this exploration of humanity's first great civilization meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you will not miss our future documentaries uncovering the secrets of the ancient world.